Alrighty. Greetings, students of Social Work 3355, Understanding Systems of Privilege and Oppression. I wanted to add another video to your viewing for this particular week. And so the title of this particular video, as you can see, is Racism is More Than Just a Black or White. Now, typically when we think about racism, oftentimes this is kind of the dynamic that comes to mind, but just wanted to take a few minutes to clarify through this presentation that it's far more than black and white. And so let's kind of dig into this piece and see what we're talking about. So again, when we think about racism, most of the time people's minds go right to this whole black and white dynamic. But basically what I've found and what I actually want to share with you all is that it's much more than that. And so this presentation is going to actually talk about a lot of systemic, structural, and individualized racism that's profound for all communities of color. So just if we go through this particular process, you'll get a little bit of a sense of what we're talking about. All right, so let's kind of go back to the original Americans, our Native American or American Indian brothers and sisters. And so we know, just by looking at this slide, in history, has not uncovered the entire truth, but we know a lot about what has actually happened to our Native American brothers and sisters in terms of colonization, racism, and genocide, which is, the actual trying to rid the planet of this particular group of human beings. And so there are some horrific things that were suffered and continue to be suffered in the Native American communities. And so even if we think about now, and think about, even if we go beyond the whole piece around the land grab and this, all of us sitting on stolen land. So those of you who own property or whose family owned property, it's really originally not your property. It's the Native Americans who were here first and had that land stolen from them through government policies, war, or treaties and policies that just did not work. So right now, when we think about the Native American population, their incomes are lower, their rate of home ownerships are lower, they have increased health disparities, they live at twice the level of poverty than most others, and these outcomes are basically tied right to this whole system of white supremacy in terms of who you are in this country. Discrimination and harassment are pretty widespread, regardless of the geographic neighborhood or the neighborhood context. The disparities in terms of how they're treated in terms of interfacing with institutions, particularly healthcare, courts, police, result in modern forms of discrimination and harassment that are systemic and untreated problems. So we still have a system. When we start to think about the major institutions, when we think about finance and education and criminal justice, housing, all of those major institutions that are part of our American society, and we start to look at as people interface with those particular entities and look at what the outcomes are for them. So when we think about, just here's just kind of an example of how bad it has been. So think about this for just a moment. When we think about the number of teams, college, professional, in a variety of sports, and think about how many Native Americans nations have just been portrayed as mascots. The Braves, the Redskins, things of that nature. And think about how disrespectful that is for that particular culture and the spirituality and the traditions that they hold dear. It's very stereotypical in terms of the images. When we see images on TV, whether it's the old Western, whether some of the older cartoons, we have these graphic depictions of Native Americans that are just offensive and downright stereotypical and not okay. I mean, think about this. How many other sports teams names an entire ethnicity or race of people by those attributes? That's just not okay in terms of that. So again, that's just the level, and that's been normalized in our society for quite some time. I mean, I think just in recent years after the death of George Floyd, people started to take notice and to recognize how racist some of these particular traditions have been and change the names of teams. But the reality is that, to go there in the first place, I just don't think you see that in any other culture other than um, the Native American culture, and it's a shameful set of circumstances that um, or that they have to endure. That we should know better. Let's talk about African Americans for a moment. So, as we know, they were originally brought to this country in chains and were slaves. They were bought and sold pretty much like property. And so, when we think about things like work, and we think about the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, uh, but white folks discriminated against folks and denied them the opportunities. And so this is evident in terms of we have U.S. law that says you can't do certain things, and then we have these black codes and Jim Crow laws that actually municipalities, states, and different communities set up these restrictions in terms of the freedoms for folks who were black. Not to mention the whole notion about being able to vote. So we see that hiring discrimination has still continues to run rampant. If we look at statistics and think about Native Americans and African Americans, they're overrepresented, and oftentimes that they are unemployed at a rate that's much greater than their white counterparts. So again, we have any number of different experiments that have been done in terms of looking at identical resumes, identical experiences, identical education piece, and not only having names that may sound ethnic or black. And we see that people aren't getting called back if they have those types of names. So again, it's a systemic thing that we're really looking at here. We've got this whole notion of redlining. And so when you think about home ownership for African Americans is lower, but government policies set things in place years and years and years ago that put certain people in certain neighborhoods and would only sell to people outside of those neighborhoods. So, and this was legal until 1968, and the GI Bill gave the middle class a strong start in terms of being able to allow them to build neighborhoods, buy affordable homes, and keeping certain communities of color out of those particular homes. And then this was sanctioned by federal, state, and local policies as well. So think about that. And then limited access to education, something that's been kind of a stigma ever since the days of slavery. Voter, you know, suppression in terms of not being able to vote. The civil rights movement of the 60s really pushed those pieces home. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was cleared. Um, but again, when we think about that, and we still see attempts even to this day about restricting early voting, or people who have criminal backgrounds aren't able to vote in some places, purging voter rolls, limiting access and times for people to actually get to polling places. Those are things that are happening to this day that, again, are designed to dilute uh, the vote for people of color. Um, and then 1 in 13 folks are just disenfranchised and are not able to vote anyway, African American. So let's talk about our Latino brothers and sisters. You're starting to see a pattern here in terms of uh, racial profiling, more often to be arrested than white folks, almost twice as likely to be killed by the police, white folks. The war on drugs started back in the 70s and 80s, targeted lower income folks, putting blacks and Latinos in prison, uh, but didn't lower the crime rate. So all of those good intentions, or were they good intentions to begin with? We have to kind of question ourselves. And then think about little known pieces of history that we just didn't know about. So, for example, like police history of violence against Latinos has been something that's been going on for 100 years. The Texas Rangers um, killed thousands and thousands of Latinos and drove many more into Mexico. Again, let's do a land grab here because Texas, California, and most of the West as we know it today in the United States was once a part of Mexico. So think about that. Um, Schools desegregated more than 50 years ago, but Latino students still have this barrier. There was this unknown piece of court battle called Menendez versus Westminster that ended school segregation in California and was led by Latinos and led into the Brown versus Board of Education. So some things that we just didn't realize. What we also found is that schools where there's more than 90% student of color, they spend less than $732 per year. Than for those students who are in the white population. Job market is built on segregation, continues to devalue the work of people of color. Latinos are less likely to have sick days and often have to choose between getting paid or taking care of themselves as their family members. The Voting Rights Act was important for Black, but didn't include Latinos for 10 years later. So think about that whole piece. You got a whole group of people that still weren't able to vote even after major legislation had been played. Bilingual health care services that leave 16 million Latinos who don't speak English very well kind of out in the cold as relates to access to adequate medical help. Chronic conditions around diabetes and obesity because of the lack of health care is determined by where it is you live. And if you've been relegated to certain neighborhoods because of pieces of legislation, then you see that this is what the outcome actually could end up being. So again, we can still continue to see this whole piece around health coverage and health insurance and how many jobs that feature Latino folks don't have those same kinds of benefits. Um, and it's a form of just systemic discrimination in terms of that. Um, Here's an interesting piece. Legal immigration from Mexico was cut in half in the 1976 enforcement beginning to deport parents and children of kids born in the United States. Beforehand, when most of the immigrants were coming from white countries, there were no restrictions on Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid for undocumented people. Now, all of a sudden, it is. Think about who's coming, what the circumstances are and what has changed. And so it was okay up until the 1970s when the number of African and Latin American folks immigrating. That's when immigration rules got tougher in terms of limiting who has access to the country and who does not. Again, systemic in its very nature. Asian Americans, a history of structural racism for Asian Americans is untold. They've been viewed as perpetual foreigners. Do you know back in the 1800s they were one of the only groups where there was an actual federal legislation that excluded them and forbid them from coming to our country because they were afraid they were going to take jobs out west. And then also, folks view Asian communities as monolithic. Everybody is coming from one place, or often are confused with other people of Asian descent as well because of the different sets of skills or physical appearances. So everybody's kind of lumped into one particular group. A lot of caricatures over the years and some of the language that they've been used to describe people or sexualize Asian women. And then they're predisposed to violence. And, even here today, we think about COVID-19 and how leaders in our own country perpetuated falsehoods that ended up getting people who were Asian American targeted. And so those are things that are very deliberate in terms of being set into place. And then you have this model minority myth that they're educated, they're successful, but then also whitewashes these health disparities that they have in terms of how things work. White racial groups divide Asians from Africans to Latinx to American Indians and other ethnic groups. 2021, awakening moment for Asians worldwide. We think about the structural racism and the brutality against people of color and the inequities that were just kind of perpetuated and just kind of made known through this prevalence of COVID-19. When we think about hate crimes, 1 in 6 persons have reported who are of Asian descent have reported hate crimes. There's been a surge. Not very long ago, there was a mass shooting that ended the life of 8 people. 6 women were Asian Americans in the southern part of the United States. So when you think about those kind of things, and we think about as we look at the other ongoing health disparities in terms of the disease and obesity and heart disease, and look at all of those things when you compare them to the white counterparts, they're much lower. And so we have to look at those are structural things that are creating these particular dynamics. Um, and then it wasn't racism wasn't born out of most importantly, it was mutually reinforced by cultural ideas and public policy. So think here we go again with the whole notion around policy that has impacted U.S. foreign immigration policy that dictates the attributes of Asian and Asian Americans who are portrayed in the United States. So just wanted to take a minute just to really have a conversation. And these are the references. So if you want to find out more about the information that I was just sharing with you, feel free to go to those places as well and click on those links, and you'll get much more information about what's going on. But as you can see, and hopefully what I was attempting to demonstrate for you is that being a person of color in this United States of America is a very, very different set of circumstances that are attached. And as you can see, group after group after group after group has clear functioning discrimination, oppression, racism that they suffer um, in our country. So just recognize that if you are a person of color and you live in this country, you will face a discriminatory situation at some point in time in your life. You can pretty much be guaranteed that it's going to actually happen. And for our white counterparts, that's not necessarily the case. It may happen, it may not happen, but it's been built into the very fabric of our country and how we see each other and how we treat each other and how we value and devalue each other that results in this differential treatment and all these different outcomes in terms of what happens for the people of color who live in our communities. So, as social workers, we've got to help put a stop to this. So, without any further ado, just want to let you know that it is more than a black and white issue. Take care.